Hello, boys and girls and children of all ages. Fat Bastard Wannabe Buddha coming at you today. Today's discussion is going to be centering around violence, Nelson Mandela, and identity politics. So hopefully I can sort of weave a little narrative that combines those three things. And I just wanted to recently come out and say what I thought about the recent Mandela situation. I find it very interesting, and it's a rehab campaign that's going on currently. The establishment, the status quo, has a desperate need to take radicalized individuals and homogenize them, to turn them into nice, safe commodities. We only, the old joke, we only love our radicals if they're dead, and there's a good bit of truth to that. The most favorite people, the Gandhis, the Martin Luther Kings, the Jesuses, the Mandelas are very quite popular once they're dead. Now, when these people are alive, they're basically commies. And, whatever slur of the time it is, Zionists, zealots, that would be Jesus, commies, womanizers, that would be both Gandhi and Martin Luther King, communists, terrorists, womanizers, that would be Mandela. Whatever it is, it's one of those interesting things. We conveniently forget all the efforts that went into, discrediting Gandhi or discrediting Martin Luther King or discrediting, hey, the CIA helped, the South African government arrest Nelson Mandela. And by and large, Nelson Mandela was a terrorist identified by the United States government, State Department for, 30, 40 years? Even when he was still in confinement, he was considered a terrorist. And that's one of the things I want to talk about. Is when I was a young man, I grew up, a little boy, in Mandela. I was in the left milieu that I grew up in. Normally more of, what was happening in Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, is what was, really popular in the early 80s because you had the Witness for Peace, and that's one of the milieu I was going into. So I didn't catch the early part of the anti-apartheid campaign. But you also got to consider I was a little bitty kid at the time, or young kid at the time, and I was basically homebound. But me and my mother came from the issue of Mandela from two slightly radical different positions. My mother was a radical individual, and she was a nice little Christian pacifist. And at the time, Mandela would refuse to renounce violence. The clerk at the time and actually Prime Minister Botha, who was heading the South African government, just said, hey, if he would just come out and denounce violence and the right to violence and everything else, we would let him out of prison. And my mother was more of a Christian pacifist and believed that apartheid was morally vile and evil. But also you couldn't use violence to overthrow that system. And me and my mother used to have a lot of debates, and Mandela provided a backdrop for a lot of those debates because Mandela at first refused to renounce violence. All that's being swept under the rug, and he's becoming a nice clean figure, just like Martin Luther King's a nice clean figure. Martin Luther King ain't a commie anymore. He isn't a guy that said basically capitalism is evil and the United States government of invading and killing in South Vietnam is an abomination before God. And yes, I said South Vietnam. We were bombing South Vietnam, not North Vietnam. We didn't bomb North Vietnam for a long period of time. That's the dirty secret of Vietnam that most people don't talk about. We were getting rid of the rebels inside of South Vietnam that didn't like the South Vietnamese government because the South Vietnamese government was illegitimate. Anyway, that's a tangent for a different time. So me and my mother would argue about the role of violence and the purpose of violence. And she was also absolutely adamant that violence, was not for her. And I must confess, since 1983, I've been a pacifist, but that is a personal argument. Yes, there's a huge there's a huge contradiction in a lot of my philosophy. Personally, I am an absolute pacifist. I had to become a pacifist because I was way too aggressive and too assertive and I was a nasty little kid at the time. I had a lot of anger issues and a lot of violence issues that I hadn't worked out. So I became a pacifist in 1983. But I recognized the right to violence. And that's one of the things that me and my mother vehemently disagreed on. My mother didn't believe there was a right to violence. And as an anarchist, I believe there is a moral right to violence. And I'm not saying defense. Let me repeat that. I'm not saying, the right to defend yourself. That's where we get the nebulous arguments on it. No, the right to violence. And what that means is in certain situations, the only recourse is violence. The only recourse. There is no gray areas. There's nothing going to happen. You will either be killed or be killed. And that's a very important thing to remember about people like Martin Luther King or Gandhi or Jesus or Mandela. Mandela is the perfect case because he shows that if he took the Gandhi approach at the beginning, in the 50s and in the 60s when Mandela was running around with the ANC, if he took the, hey, we're just going to, sing Kumbaya and do peaceful passive protests in the streets, they would have been gunned down by the hundreds of thousands because they were gunned down by the hundreds of thousands. The same with Martin Luther King. If Martin Luther King 50 to 60 years earlier decided to do the March on Selma, they would have killed them. That's right. And if you doubt this, look what they did to several communities. They basically came in a certain southern Florida town, and they destroyed everyone in the town. And that was in the 30s. Same with Gandhi. There was people like Gandhi that showed up before Gandhi did, 50 years earlier. They were killed instantly. The British government knew how to deal with them. And this is a very important lesson that the left has sort of forgot. There was a big, huge debate between Christopher Hedges and the Black Bloc Brigade about what are the appropriate tactics. Well, there is an appropriate tactics for violence in certain situations. When there is no other recourse, in which you will be destroyed if you do not take up arms. And this is what we desperately need to recognize in people like Mandela or King or Gandhi or Jesus. The appropriate tactics for the appropriate situation. Do I recognize this current situation will be alleviated by violence? No. Unfortunately, the empire that you're facing down is way too intransigent and too powerful. This is basically what would happen is the same things that happened to the original zealots at Masada. The Roman Empire will just grind you under the heels. But you have to take your opportunity and know when and how to strike. That's what Gandhi taught you, and that's what King taught you. And we failed to learn that lessons. And another piece before I get over it real quick, I wanted to point out there's a great article that let me pull up on the screen because my memory's failing me. By Mitchell Roberts' blog, which is one of the Marxist economists that I read, that it's called Mandela's Economic Legacy, and it points out one of the major reasons why Mandela was successful or able to transition from a white minority rule into a black majority rule is that a white minority or the rich people inside that country had recognized the fact that economically the country was collapsing. That economically they had no recourse but otherwise to allow a modicum of reforms in the society. Otherwise, they would lose the gravy train. And Mandela had the benefit and the liability of actually having to govern. And this is one of the things I want to touch on about identity politics. Martin Luther King, Gandhi had the unfortunate ability to govern too, and it didn't turn out as well either. Mandela had to govern and had to rule and had to placate the dominant capital interest of, white South Africa. And yes, they have black leadership, and yes, they have the ANC. And if you watch the funeral, which I did, you would notice that the only person that was booed was the current president of the ANC, And it's not just because the current president of the ANC is a corrupt SOB, which he is. You know, Robert Mugabe didn't get booed, but you know the current ANC president got booed in South Africa, and the reason is that not just because the guy's corrupt, building a $20 billion mansion for himself, but also because the ANC and black leadership on white South Africa have failed to change the basic fundamentals for the black majority. The great majority of black South Africans are still toiling in absolute horrific conditions. They don't, you know, it's still, you know, they were hoping they would get indoor plumbing, and it still hasn't happened for them. You know, and the ANC cracked down on the black miners' strike, you know, because the neoliberals, the capitalists wanted them to. They're basically water carriers, and they're just front people for the same dominant economic, political, and social issues that's always run that country. And the same thing is happening into America with Obama. Obama is a nice front figure, and he triangulates the left very good in the sense that you can't have the left go out of their way to attack him. And he's got a core base that won't ever do anything, even though his core base, the number of individuals that are Latinos that are being deported under Obama has actually increased. The level of poverty for black folks under Obama has actually increased. The level of job unemployment for black folks, for Latinos, for any and all minorities have increased under Obama. You know, and that's one of the things us Marxists, you know, had a problem with identity politics. First, you got to fundamentally deal with the economics. And I know I rambled on two different tangential points, but I hope people took something out of this. I hope they got some ideas of what I've been thinking about recently. And I'm sorry I haven't been uploading as quickly as I wanted to. My blogs don't, you know, are floating around that 20% views, and it's very frustrating. But that's a personal thing. I do think violence is an option, but right now the way in which our society is not a viable means currently. But you do have a right to violence. You do have a right, not just to self-defense. If the United States government has the right to blow up crap, or the German or the French, an individual has a right to. You know, and that's one of the things that an anarchist never can surrender. The basic right to violence, and not to caveat it, not to cover it up with the right to, you know, right of defense. It isn't. It's the right to do something really nasty and brutal and evil because there is no other choice. And also, identity politics is a dead end. Sadly, you do have to fundamentally deal with the economic issues before we can even think about dealing with all the other multitude of problems that we have as a species. Anyway, that's the Fat Bastard Wannabe Buddha talking to you today. Hope people take something out of this, and if not, please, I'll hopefully said something that ticked somebody off. Have a good day. Thank you.